looking into trauma and just understanding it in some quick notes, one of the first things that I think is always important is to know this isn't about them. Normally we say this isn't about us, this is about them, but I'm actually presenting that this isn't about them, it's about us. And why I say that is that we are trauma survivors too. More than likely, everyone on this call has had at least a very challenging life experience that really altered how you thought about yourself, how you thought about others, how you thought about the world. And so when we start seeing it as us, the learning about us, it makes it much easier to first understand the topic and the training, but most specifically understand them, the folks that we're working with and for. They are us and we are them, right? It's folks having real life experiences. And we're thinking about how do we show up in a way that can be supportive. And quite frankly, some of this you can use, all of this really, you can use for yourself, because some of us have some trauma we haven't healed. And so just thinking about how this applies to us could be helpful. Lastly, I think it's always important, I'm going to cover the potential impacts of trauma from the negative experience perspective, right? But let's be clear, having a traumatic experience in life does not mean that you are destined for subpar outcomes, right? It certainly the data shows that once you have traumatic experiences, there's other crap that can happen, right? But it doesn't mean that you're destined, right, for that. So let's just make sure when you listen to me and when you go out and do the work that we're not assuming that just because folks have had rough experiences and are maybe in the middle of some really rough stuff in their lives, that doesn't mean that the future is necessarily dim. All right, so quick overview on trauma. I have on your screen how SAMHSA defines trauma. Individual trauma results from an event or series of events or circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and has lasting adverse effects on physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. The visual on your screen is from the ACE study. Let me know in the chat if you guys are familiar with the ACE study. Hopefully you are. The ACE study asked 10 questions, and each of these little images represent one of those 10 questions about the different types of trauma a child could experience in their life, and indicated, that as a result, there are some negative outcomes that could happen later. On the right side of your screen, there are some things that aren't listed there as potential ideas for trauma: witnessing or experiencing violence, separation from loved one. So that's loss, abandonment, divorce, even breakup. Sometimes we don't think about breakup or divorce as traumatic, but those of us who've been through a hard breakup know that's life altering, right? Natural disasters, we look at obviously hurricanes, COVID, all of that stuff. I think we can all account for and confirm that 2020 has been traumatic, right? But two that aren't thought about is poverty and systemic oppression, which we'll talk about in a second. But what I really want you to understand is that trauma, whether it's trauma, depends on who you ask, right? So if Jennifer and I were twins, born of the same mom and dad, we might have exactly the same historical experience. Maybe we both had abuse by our dad, right? But one of us, the way we internalize that experience, would call it trauma. Like it was very disruptive in our lives. Maybe we fell into addiction, just really had a hard time from there. The other of us processed it differently, right? And so while we would say it was a hard time and a hard experience, we wouldn't necessarily define it as a trauma. So it's not necessarily about the thing that happened, it's about how an individual processes it, that sort of registers as trauma. So it's important to remember that, because you could encounter someone who you find out has like what you think is the most ridiculously crazy thing ever happened to them. And so you start to assume that life must be really hard and they're just really going through and they're really struggling. But in fact, they've handled it quite well. On the flip side, you might encounter someone who in your mind has some experiences that you don't think are that major, but to them, they were life altering. So it's just important that we're not assuming what trauma means. It's really all about the individual's experience and how they process that. On the racism side, it's really important for us to also know that racism is trauma, oppression is trauma. And so I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but it just kind of speaks to a lot of the symptoms, which you're going to see show up in the following slides about how trauma can show up as far as symptoms in an individual's life. These symptoms that are at the bottom of your screen and reactions to trauma are very much similar, if not exact, to what you might see in a rape survivor or a child abuse survivor or neglect survivor. So memory loss, nightmares, depression, feeling like you want to avoid things, increased vigilance, all of those things are again, symptoms that you see in other traumas, but those specifically show up for folks who are dealing with racism. So it's important to note when we're working with minority populations that those are some additional components that we really need to be thoughtful about. The biggest note to me about trauma is that it's a hidden wound, right? So on your screen, you see this brain. On the left side is this healthy brain. And then on the right side, you see an abused brain. And you can obviously see that there's a total difference in that imagery. And I think that's the big thing to note about trauma is that you can't see it. And so different than when we talk about other disabilities or very impactful life experiences, it's hard to know what's going on with the trauma. So if I have a broken leg and I walk in the room with a cast on my leg, you're obviously going to know that something happened and I'm going through something. But with trauma, we can't see it. So it can impact us in many ways. Neurodevelopment, it can be an issue. Our cortisol levels can be impacted, and that's that stress hormone that helps us manage and deal with stress. And as a result, when those cortisol levels are impacted, we could be more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and PTSD. There was actually a study done on Holocaust survivors' grandchildren that found that even those who hadn't experienced any direct trauma in their lives, just by being the descendants of folks who had experienced trauma, were more likely to have these different symptoms and potential diagnoses later. Again, something to note when we think about racism and oppression, when you're working with populations who have a history of traumatic experience.
Hay una historia un historial de experiencias traumáticas.
We're getting a little bit of feedback from, I believe, one of the interpreters.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, thank you for muting.
Okay, if there was a question, let me know. So yeah, anyway, the just understanding that these kind of realities are important when you think about minority populations and those who've been through racism and oppression and things of that nature. So that means that I could be born into an increased likelihood for these things just because my grandparents went through such a thing. Obviously, health and disease are things that can come out. The ACE study helped us to understand that. Behavior issues and the adoption of health risk behavior. So you think about coping. So we joked a little bit about drinking wine, you know, to deal with stress, but we know that there's sort of that spectrum of when having a glass here and there or engaging in some sort of substance here or there becomes a coping mechanism. And because of that adoption of risky and health risk behaviors, that's where you start to see some of the ACE study outcomes show where we have early death, we have disease, cancer, all of those kinds of things kick in. I think we still have somebody off mute. Thank you. So again, just important to understand that we can't see it. So we really just have to be thoughtful and really tuned in relationally to have a sense of who we're dealing with and how we might need to respond, which we're going to spend some time, a lot of time today, getting into how do we respond to this stuff. So just a quick list of some of the signs, symptoms, and coping mechanisms. And these are things you can see in youth and adults. And I think that's another thing we miss, especially in the youth work world. We tend to think of trauma and trauma surviving from a youth perspective, but it's really important to note that adults were once kids who had potential trauma in their youth. And hello, we're adults and we know life is hard in adulthood, right? So it's not just something that happens in childhood, it's really life, you know? So when you have trauma, these are just some of the things that might show up, whether it's headaches and stomach aches, the way in which it might manifest physically, anger, in the sense of, you think about youth acting out in school, and, we're punitive, punishing that, but is it that they're misbehaving, or is it that they're struggling to express that what they're experiencing traumatically, right? Or some historical experience they haven't been able to resolve. So a lot of these behaviors, interestingly, show up as bad kid behavior, right? So that's another reason why it's so important that we think about a trauma-informed response. They also show up as bad parent behavior, right? And so that's another thing that I stress when working with folks who serve youth, is that we got to really make sure that we're showing up as passionately for the adults in our youth's lives and their parents as we are them. Because when we show up supportive of the youth, but judgmental of the parent because of their behavior or whatever they have going on, we really missed it. We really missed the boat when we do that. So yeah, stomach aches high, that's a good one. Again, it's just hard to know. Sometimes you think you're just tired, but it's really related to something else. Or you think you just have a headache, but just important to kind of keep these in mind. The last thing I want to note on this is that sometimes there's no sign at all, and or the second to the last point on their positive symptoms. I am a person who, I had trauma early in life, and I had zero acting out. Like no one, everyone was completely blown away when I finally told my story after I was an adult, because I was a high performer. I was always doing well in school and this and that. And quite frankly, sometimes those are trauma responses. By performing well, by being a perfectionist, by kind of staying out of the way, being quiet. So we got to also remember not to leave out loving on and supporting the folks who aren't acting out or don't look like anything's wrong. That doesn't mean that there's not something they're going through. So just something to keep in mind. Any questions on the super quick high level overview of trauma?
Yeah, Elizabeth, I have something, a question. It was interesting right now that you said that, like, if there's positive symptoms, I have to assume that there hasn't been trauma. So how would you like deal with someone if it's positive? Wouldn't we want those behaviors to keep going, or?
Well, yeah, good question. Here's the thing. I mean, you could argue that that's better, right, than a kid who's not doing well in school. However, I can tell you again from personal experience, at some point I had to check down, like, dude, I mean, I get a lot of kudos for all these freaking letters behind my name, but at what point is that not traumatic in and of itself for me to continue to so it's almost like I had to start realizing that I was doing it to validate myself. So it's not positive anymore if I'm performing well to continue to try to prove to myself that I'm worthy. So when you look behind that behavior, there's something that we could really maybe adjust there, right? So yes, it's great you're doing great in school, or yes, it's great that you're doing great in your career. But if doing great is tied to perfectionism and high stress and anxiety, if you don't do everything perfect, you have to have an A. Now we get to a whole nother, a different kind of stress, right? So does that make sense as to why there could be some issues with a positive symptom? Makes sense? Yeah, okay. Anybody else thoughts on that? Go ahead.
No,
Gustavo.
it makes perfect sense. Yeah, I think it could be like the behaviors that you're trying to, exactly like you said, you're trying to validate yourself or prove something that is leading you towards those behaviors. So interesting.
Yeah, and it's sad because it's a lot of those kids will never be in our programs, because we tend to, most programs like these attract the folks who are getting attention for the wrong reasons, right? So sadly, sometimes we overlook those folks.
And so this is and I also want to say, like, sometimes that comes into codependency, where they get into the cycle of like, I need to perform well in order to be liked or in order to validate myself. And we should see that here as well.
Absolutely. Good point. Yeah. So, I mean, so right now I don't do clinical work anymore. I do some executive coaching, and I work with some high-end blue chip clients like athletes and stuff like that. Right. So you're like, oh, you got it all together. You're making money and people know you and all that. But so what I see, and this is again been the case in my life, is that my trauma has benefited me in some ways because it's motivated me to perform. But I can look back and say, sometimes I go too hard, right? Like there's ways in which some of that stuff isn't so healthy, right? So those are things later in life I've kind of adjusted. I first, of course, worked on all the funky negative stuff, but then I had to start looking at myself to say, what are some of the positive things that maybe I'm going too far with? So Good stuff.